Welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week I'm joined again by my colleague, Isaac Woodward, to react to Ben Shapiro's debate on Jubilee with 25 Kamala Harris supporters. Obviously, with the election coming up very, very soon, in less than a week when this is being recorded, topics such as Israel are at the top of the cultural debate and conversation. That's what me and Isaac are going to be reacting to and responding to today. A lot of the arguments presented in this debate with Ben Shapiro are things we've seen in the media and at protests over the last year since October 7 and Israel's subsequent counteroffensive. If you like this video, please like it and comment whether you agree or disagree. If we missed anything in this video, just add that down below and we can have a conversation in the comment section. And please subscribe to the Philos Project YouTube channel so you can be notified when we post both this podcast and all of our other media offerings. I hope you enjoy this video. Isaac Woodward, welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. I'm so excited.
Thanks, Dominique. It's a pleasure to be back.
I look forward to our conversations because we do love the cultural reactions to people in the media on the left and the right. And one video that's gone viral this past week is Ben Shapiro debating 25 Kamala Harris voters. Charlie Kirk also did that, I think a few weeks ago. It was on Jubilee, the YouTube channel. They do a lot of kind of cultural conversations and debates. I definitely think that the platform leans left, but I do think they were pretty fair in the fact checking that they do throughout the video with Ben Shapiro. But the premise of this one video is Ben Shapiro sits in the middle of kind of a round circle, and the different participants have to basically race to get a seat with Ben Shapiro to debate one of the claims Ben Shapiro makes. And I encourage the audience to go just watch it. He makes 4 separate claims. I believe one of them is on the border, the other is on abortion, and then the claim that we're going to be responding to is on Israel. And Ben Shapiro's claim, which I'm going to let him speak for himself, but had President Trump had a second term, October 7th would not have happened, is a kind of a provocative claim. I don't even know if I myself would go as far as to make it, but there's definitely been some things that this current administration has done, including waiving over $50 billion in sanctions with Iran, that has financially empowered Iran. And they have also abandoned the legacy of the Abraham Accords from the Trump administration, which definitely impacts foreign policy in the region. But before we even get into the video, me and you both go to a lot of rallies and you kind of spearhead a lot of our advocacy with our network. What are some of the pro-Palestine, but kind of veering more pro-Hamas arguments that you've seen on the streets at a lot of rallies? I know Columbia, UCLA.
Yeah, so there's a wide spectrum. You have the extreme of people I've encountered in conversations that will just deny anything about October 7th. They say it was a Mossad or CIA operation, it's all fake, and then they go on to have debates or arguments. But at that point, you have no shared common facts you can cite, so it can get a little bit unuseful. But on the other end, I think a lot of people that are maybe in the middle, it's still kind of radical, but they see themselves as the moral crusaders, come out for what they call the humanitarian concerns. They just basically see the raw figures of loss of life on the civilian side, which comes only from Hamas and is not vetted or verified by other groups. To the extent external groups have attempted to audit it, the UN has repeatedly revised down their estimates after looking into data a little bit more. But that aside, there are certainly civilian casualties, but some people will just look at those raw figures and then say, this must be unfair. And in particular, maybe do a comparison between the amount of Israeli deaths and say there's a mismatch here, as if there's some moral principle that there should be equal amounts of death in a given conflict versus what's actually happening. It's almost like assuming you see a fight on the street, you don't know what's happening, and you want there to be the same amount of wounds or bruises or injuries apart from knowing anything about the justification for the fight. It's just not really how moral operations work. But there is a, noble impulse to care for the innocents. But the important thing to keep in mind is who are the actual threats to the innocents? Who are those putting them in harm's way and causing the need for the IDF to go in there and try to rescue people and uproot Hamas? And of course, that's Hamas's fault. And then what are the actual ways you could aid the long-going security of these innocent people?
I think it's a great point. I think the West really struggles with the uncomfortable reality of war. And we see Ben Shapiro debate this in the clips we're going to react to, but conflating innocent lives being lost with genocide, attributing the loss of innocent life to some deeper intent on the part of the Israeli government to destroy, in part or in whole, the Palestinian people. So I think in the West, we do wrestle with, because we are so far removed from living in conflict, the idea of innocent lives being lost in urban warfare, which is unfortunately a negative externality, but one that happens. So we'll see that kind of throughout this video. And I think also another claim that I see that's really prevalent is, well, Gaza is an open air prison. There's a blockade on Gaza. And so October 7th was inevitable. Other claims, which we've already talked about, Israel's committing a genocide against the Palestinian people. All of it goes to undermine Israel's right to defend itself. And I think Ben Shapiro does a really great job at kind of countering that. And we'll have some takeaways at the end, just overall, some of the common themes between each one of these debaters. But I'm going to let Ben Shapiro make his claim, and then we'll get his explanation for it. I also want to preface for the audience, Ben Shapiro talks fast, but I have to speed it up so that we can react to it in a timely manner, and also for copyright reasons. So Ben Shapiro is going to sound very rapid fire, but bear with us.
My next claim is the Israel-Hamas war would not have started under Donald Trump.
If you watch the clip, you can see how they all kind of rush to the chair. So his claim is that the Israel-Hamas war would not have started under the Trump administration, and this is his explanation.
So what evidence do you have to support that claim?
Okay, so the latest reports from the New York Times of internal papers from Yahya Sinwar suggested that he was essentially counting on Iranian interference and help with the October 7th attacks, and that was incentivized by the fact that Iran was attempting to forestall any sort of deal between Israel and the Saudi government for Saudi to join the Abraham Accords. It was very well known at the time, and I happen to know, that the Saudi government was very much ready to join the Abraham Accords if Donald Trump had been reelected. If that had happened, that would have forestalled Hamas action, because the incentive to have done what happened on October 7th would largely have been gone at that point. The entire purpose of that attack was to prevent the formation of a broader Sunni-Israeli alliance in the Middle East.
So Ben Shapiro is kind of laying the groundwork for where we were on October 7 of 2023. I do largely agree with him. The Biden administration was trying to kind of continue the legacy of the Abraham Accords, of course, towards the beginning of the administration's time in office. We withdrew from Afghanistan, which was really a huge blunder and kind of set the tone for this administration's role in the Middle East, both through hard and soft power. It kind of signaled weak strategy and diplomacy. And then around this time as well, China swept into the region and normalized ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was also historic. So we saw waning U.S. influence in the region, but it was believed that Saudi Arabia was still interested in normalizing ties with Israel, which was kind of the last component or last part of the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration didn't see realized because he was not elected into a second term. And many believe that October 7th was largely motivated because normalization seems kind of imminent, and this was Hamas's attempt to spoil that. One of the reasons Saudi Arabia has never normalized with Israel has been the Palestinian issue. Hamas, the Palestinian cause, the PA, has used the issue of self-determination as kind of a voting issue for the Arab bloc. So essentially kind of using that to prevent Israel from normalizing with other Arab states, which was why the Abraham Accords was so novel and historic when they were signed. Do you have anything to kind of add about kind of the context or the geopolitical time in which the October 7th attacks happened?
Yeah, so there's two aspects to that. The first thing to consider is, what was the immediate precipitating event? If you want to talk about being unhappy with certain conditions on the ground, or objecting to treatment, or the claim about open air prison, all of that, existed in their claims for a while. So what was the immediate precipitating event? We have intelligence also to the effect that this was part of their direct aims. So it's not just speculation. But you could see from the perspective of Hamas, which has been increasingly disdained, and more broadly, even the toleration of a lot of the Palestinian people for Hamas in the West Bank and in Gaza has increasingly frustrated a lot of the Arab neighbors around. And then you have to ask, okay, well, what's their claim? Are they in favor of apartheid? Are they racist? Are they whatever claim you want to throw at Israel? Why would they be aligning their interests here? And clearly that's not the case. They see the threat from Iran, and they also, more importantly, see whatever sympathy they have for the Palestinian people. If there's not an actual peace partner, there's not a coalition that can come together to make a peace deal, what is the alternative? And I think it's important to note on the point of open-air prison claim, people can often look at the fact that maybe a given day before October 7th, there wasn't shooting or firing and assume there was like peace. But there's a whole spectrum of peace and hostilities that exist in international law and diplomacy and warfare. You could have actual alliances with either mutual defense or at the very least like common interests. You could just have cold neutrality with no real bilateral relations, but also no active hostility. You could have temporary peace deals for a time where then hostilities will resume, or you could basically have like an armistice or a ceasefire. And in this case, there wasn't even an armistice agreement. For example, that's what exists between North and South Korea. There's no alliance. There's no even formal thing saying we're at peace and we've resolved. It's just like we're going to stop shooting right now, but we're both armed to the teeth and ready for it any second. And in the case of Gaza, there was no armistice we got from Hamas. There was nothing like that. There was basically the point where they were military defeated for a time and then subdued, and the attempt for self-determination of the Palestinians in Gaza was offered, and then they end up slaughtering the opposing party of Fatah in 2006 and 7 and taking over and ruling as basically a terror state. So at that point, there's no duty for neighboring powers next to an entity that has sworn their death to, one, have free access in and out, which actually even then Israel repeatedly, even a lot of the people that were killed in the kibbutzim on October 7th, had done daily trips going into Gaza, taking out kids to hospitals, helping get work permits, doing all these things, which is kind of amazing. Like, imagine if North and South Korea had that, like, yeah, we're enemies, but like we can go back and forth for hospitals or other things. Like, that's an amazing amount of generosity on the part of the Israeli people. But yes, when it comes to allowing free movement from the sea to import terror and weapons, which Iran is constantly trying to get them across, Israel doesn't allow that. They have a perimeter out beyond which cargo has to be searched. There has to be rules, and things easily made into military or terror materials have to be withheld. That's just how any rational state would operate against an entity that it's sworn to kill and maim those that they border. And we saw on October 7th, that was their only method. This was not the cry of the defenseless. When you have hordes of young men going, killing, pillaging, raping civilians, intentionally trying to provoke a response that's clearly not in the line of legitimate protest against oppression and occupation, as they claim.
Yeah, I agree. And we're going to see, I believe his name is Mohammed, kind of make that argument that it is legitimate, or until the Palestinian question is solved, any form of resistance is legitimate. So we do. So we have a Saudi normalization and Hamas using October 7th as an act of attrition to spoil that. We have ideological, as you pointed out. It is quite literally within their ideological aims, their stated aims, to eradicate Israel from the river to the sea, which is a slogan for genocide in the actual definition of genocide. And then, as I mentioned in the opening, they also had financial incentives. This was kind of the time to act, if there ever was one, with the Biden administration completing quite a few different deals with Iran in the summer of 2023. There was a prisoner exchange deal in which they received $6 billion. The Biden administration also waived $10 billion in sanctions for frozen assets in Iraq, which were transferred to Iranian accounts in Oman, and then additional waivers or not enforcing sanctions against Iran so that they could sell their oil, namely to China, our largest adversary. So there's been quite a few diplomatic blunders. And this isn't political. I know we're kind of in the lead up to an election. These are just some of the facts on the ground that shaped Hamas's calculus to act when they did on October 7th. So we're going to now kind of see this guy's rebuttal to Ben's explanation.
See how 17 years of a land, air, sea blockade will happen if that's not a symptom to allowing people basically pressure cook its way into something like that happening.
Okay, the idea that October 7th was specifically as an incident caused by movement between Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah, coordination between those groups for geopolitical reasons is the claim. If the claim that you're making is that October 7th was sort of an inevitability based on the conditions on the ground in the Gaza Strip, that's not exactly how I think.
So he's kind of making that claim that Israel created the conditions for October 7 with blockading Gaza in an open air prison, so to speak. And his question is, well, then what else were they to do? Doesn't that make October 7th inevitable due to the actions of Israel, quote unquote, as an occupied power? What would you say to Mohammed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a failure to look at the sequence of events. We could go back really far, but as we talked before, Israel did not want Gaza when they had the peace deal where they eventually gave back the Sinai. They also wanted to give back Gaza and have it be controlled by Egypt. Egypt didn't want it. And you could ask, why exactly is that? Why would they not want this lovely beachfront property? It's because they also see political intransigence and self-defeating tendencies on the part of Hamas and the terrorists that ruled it at different times. So then Israel's like, okay, we're stuck with this. So for decades, they had more open access, more ease of flow back and forth. They also allowed Jews to go live there. The IDF did more ground patrols and more kind of intense occupation-like activities. You might refer to it as similar to happening in the West Bank. And there was protests against that. They said, we don't want this. Like, we hate this. We want to get rid of it. So Israel's like, okay, unilaterally, nothing on the table, no promises of peace, no guarantees, no nothing, just withdrawal, and then forcibly evict all of the Jewish people that had gone to live there, and then give back all the materials, everything they had, and said, here is your place, do with it what you will. And then consistently, over more than a decade, close to 20 years now, we've seen them use whatever opportunities they have to take resources, use them for terror. They've constructed a massive tunnel system larger than the London Underground. The amount of cost, engineering, time, and attention that goes into that is staggering. And that should be a basic thing. Why do you need all of those things unless you are planning to do, terror operations? The IDF does not randomly strike even members of Hamas prior to this in Gaza. It was after provocations and responses. But if you're sworn to seek death of your enemies above all else, above the care for your people, your women, your children, your society, the growth of your economy, then that's what you're going to get, and you're going to get blockaded. And then to break out of that on a mass slaughter when you've created the entire situation, which has precipitated those negative factors, is completely unjustifiable.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Gaza is the result of Israel withdrawing. So the argument that it's an occupying power when it doesn't govern the Gaza Strip in any way, there is no area A, B, and C territory, such as in the West Bank. There's no cooperation between those two governing powers, is just fallacious. And that's an argument we see all the time in the media. So in this next clip, we're going to see Mohammed kind of ask the question, well, who did the Abraham Accords benefit? And he's insinuating it benefited everyone but the Palestinians.
Now, if we go and keep ignoring the Palestinian problem, then I don't understand how we can continue to act like forging partnerships between Gulf Arab countries is going to promote stability to the region when we're leaving out 2 million people in Gaza and then 2 million people in the West
Bank. It was promoting a lot more stability in the region. For the Saudis, for the Bahrainis, for the UAE.
And then, October 7th still, you're telling me October 7th still happened because of geopolitical reasons in that area. If the Palestinians are not addressed in the Abraham Accords, why do you think that there was a need for October 7th?
I think what's interesting is he's not acknowledging the ideological motivation of Iran, which Iran and its bent on terror and its zero-sum aims for the region to export the revolution across the Middle East is what binds all the Gulf states' interest to Israel. So it is because of Iran and its rogue threat to the region and its possession of enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon that motivates the security interest of the Abraham Accords. I also think it's very interesting. I think it's very Western, although this has kind of become the Palestinian moral question has been central to geopolitics in the Middle East. But the idea that the Palestinian question with 2 million people should shape an entire region is it reminds me of kind of the self-centered nature of politics here in the United States, that a minority should then be able to bend the political calculus of the majority. So there's kind of that Western slant in the argument that he's making, but I think he completely either doesn't get, or because it undermines his argument, has ignored the threat of Iran, which is what binds all these countries together.
Yeah. Again, you could vilify the motives of Israelis as much as you want, but then you have to look, okay, what about the immediate neighbors around who speak the same language, share the same religion? What is their attitude and outlook towards the Palestinian people and their prospects for a two-state solution? And then what is the record of what they've done? They initiated 2 large-scale wars in 67 and 73, and numerous other terror-supported attacks against Israel. And then that kind of started to fade off when these allied countries realized, well, I mean, Israel's there, but they're not trying to kill us. They have shown they will give back land for peace. They're kind of working with us. We don't like them exactly, but they're there. We can trade with them. We can do whatever. And then they keep looking, well, what about our Palestinian brothers and sisters? And then the ways that they've squandered peace deals over and over again. And in this clip, Mohammed goes on to say, like, for who? Like, why weren't the Palestinians brought into Abraham Accords? All of these other things. And this all goes back to just a fundamental misunderstanding of what the entities are. There's a massive checkerboard arrangement of clans and different loyalties and gangs and parties across the West Bank and across Gaza. It's imagine like if you said, okay, there's problems on the south side of Chicago, and the police and the mayor say, we want to go in and make a deal, like, to fix all the crime. Let's get rid of the crime. Let's improve conditions. But you have a bunch of different rival gangs and interests and competing authorities. Who would they all, lay down their guns to agree with, to send to the table to make that deal? Then once they made it, what is to say they're going to keep it and then not jockey for power, not have assassinations, recriminations, all of these kind of things that we see across these terror networks, and even in the gang context. So you need an actual authority figure to come to a table that then, when you take that piece of paper agreement away, they actually have some ability to enforce. And that's something we have not seen on the Palestinian side. And in the absence of that, there's no alternative other than an external military force doing something to contain those threats, which is what happened in Gaza, or across the West Bank. There's a variety of Israeli security cooperation that allows a quasi-legitimate government in the PLA to exist.
Yeah, I agree. And I think Ben kind of touches on some of the roadblocks to this in this upcoming clip.
There's 3 options. Willful emigration of the Palestinian people, like live under subjugation as a second-class citizen of Israeli rule, or third, die. What's the option?
No, I mean, moderating and then electing a government that is worthy of actually governing its people and not stealing billions of dollars from its people, either the Palestinian Authority, Islamic Jihad, or Hamas, would be an excellent start.
So I need to understand, do you feel like they have the opportunity to do so when they're under the subjugation of 17 years of a blockade by an occupying power? If for 17 years, since the disengagement of Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, Israel was able, by the flick of a switch, to turn off the electricity, water supply, and fuel reserves right now.
Okay, that was really sped up. But essentially what Ben is saying is, no, there is an alternative. They could elect a party that is not going to have terrorist aims, and there is a solution other than terror. And he's saying there is agency on the part of the Palestinian people, who did elect Hamas into power and who have largely favored Hamas since October 7. Kind of the popularity of the October 7 attacks and of Hamas and Gazan public opinion is really hard to determine because the state-run media controls kind of that information. So it's hard to get a temperature for what the average Gazan believes or feels towards Hamas as a governing body. But Mohammed is essentially claiming, well, how can they ever find a solution if the occupying force is there? And it completely absolves the Palestinians living in Gaza of any agency and of any responsibility. But my big kind of question to him would be, so then who is supposed to govern the Palestinian people if they've elected Hamas into power? So what is the solution? Because that question should be asked to the Palestinians and not to Israel. So then he's looking to Israel, who he's claiming is the occupying power, for a solution to the current governing situation in Gaza. It's quite a paradox.
Yeah, they're both the cause of the problems, but also the whole weight of the burden of the solution for their humanitarian and political needs also falls on Israel. But also, they don't want Israel to occupy and exert control. So there's no win. Like, it's their fault. If they get involved, they're oppressing and occupying. If they don't, then they're creating an open air prison. It's so unclear from that clip. Even, okay, did he prefer the status quo prior to 2006 to be better, when Israel did have boots on the ground more? There was a little bit more free flow between. There were also Jewish people living there. Was that better? I thought that was occupation. Okay. Then after the withdrawal, what's the expectation? That you have a totally free-flowing border where anybody just goes back and forth? That's not how most countries in the world operate. That's not how the countries that border the West Bank operate. That's not how Egypt on its border with Gaza operates. You're putting up a standard of you want this access and freedom. Well, that's not even what the Arab countries around have given them. And it just goes back to, fundamentally, you just have to say Israel is illegitimate, has no right to exist on the land, because were they to do any of those operations that he wanted, one, there is no political authority which could secure some kind of peace or stability even for the Gazan people, much less the relations between Gaza and Israel. So it's just, yeah, it's quite a weight to put on the Israelis, that they're the cause of everything, but also to the extent they get involved to meddle or try to fix things, then they're also taking away the self-determination of the Palestinian people.
And our colonizers and occupiers. It's a redefining of terms to fit an argument. So Israel is quite literally the result of decolonization after World War II. And Israel withdrew from Gaza, which, as you had mentioned, Egypt had previously occupied or governed. Annexed would be a more technical term. And they withdrew, which is the first step. And it was supposed to be an act of goodwill in allowing the Palestinians to self-determine. It was supposed to be an experiment to see if they could. And it created a power vacuum for terrorism. And I don't think this is popular to say, but I do believe the people who initially elected them into power do have responsibility in that. Also, the line between civilian and terrorist in Gaza is a very thin line. A lot of the hostages who have been rescued from the homes of doctors or lawyers or families within the Gaza Strip who have housed the hostages. So we've seen even in the last year that line is very blurry. And as I said, we can't quite determine what that measure of popular support is amongst Palestinians in Gaza, but it's definitely significant enough to not absolve your average citizen from any agency in perpetuating their situation. The other thing I want to point out is he keeps talking about the blockade, electricity, water. Israel is not responsible. If Gaza was supposed to be this experiment for Palestinian self-determination, Israel is therefore, after withdrawing, not responsible to provide that infrastructure to Gaza. And if Gaza didn't squander the aid that it got internationally or steal from the Palestinian people, they would be able to provide that infrastructure. Instead, they've used that money to create underground infrastructure and terror infrastructure with the tunnels in Gaza. So it's the misappropriation of funds and a lack of order and stewardship at the governing level of Hamas. They're at fault, not Israel. So again, it kind of like blaming Israel, the quote unquote occupying power, for not providing services that Hamas should be providing their people. We're going to see in this next clip, they're going to be talking about aid, which is something else that we've seen. Even the current administration has largely conditioned aid on the humanitarian concerns in Gaza. And we see Ben kind of react to why, from a logistical and security perspective, getting aid to some of the areas where the offensive is currently happening is quite difficult. So we're going to see him explain that here.
Says that this humanitarian crisis is man-made. It is man-made.
I agree that it's man-made.
And I know who you think the man is.
Yes.
I'm telling you, there's only...
Does Hamas have any agency here at all?
I'm telling you that right now, if
Does
you
the
want...
Palestinians have any agency
The
here at all?
Palestinians absolutely have agency, but again, with an occupying force, what does the agency limit to? If a Gaza fisherman can't go 6 miles past the nautical line that Israel has arbitrarily placed, what agency is there?
Why do you think that Israel placed that line?
Again, that's what I'm telling you, is that how
Just
do you...
for fun or what?
Again,
do you think Israel wants soldiers in the Gaza Strip?
Again, here's the thing.
I
know that high-level cabinet members in the Israeli government right now is saying that we're going to resettle on Gaza.
Okay. So I think Ben asks a very good question. So does Hamas not have any agency here? I think maybe a term other than agency would be responsibility in creating the conditions and threatening Israel's security, which then precipitates them creating these boundaries, such as the 6 mile nautical line. And he glazes right over that. It's just because they're an occupying power. And by using that term, using the oppressor-oppressed paradigm, it absolves Hamas from any responsibility in creating the situation that we now see on the ground.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of different parallels you could draw throughout history of, after World War II, the times that the Allies had boots on the ground, and we still have boots on the ground in places like Germany, Japan, and other places. And there's a wide spectrum, but before you object to places with true presences you don't like, you have to ask, well, why did they get there? And if they got there as a result of a aggressive war against them, and then the attempt to keep peace, some of the blame lays on there. But also Israel's demonstrated more than even most of those other countries that they don't have any interest or desire to be occupying those areas. And again, if people go to Israel or meet Israelis, talk to them, it's a very personal thing. There's universal draft. It's not a abstract across the oceans desert kind of thing like it is for us here. It's, do I want my cousin and my brother and my sister to spend their years like walking in the streets of Gaza to keep things safe? No, nobody wants that. That's why they made that unilateral decision, even kicking Jews out of the areas they built up and made prosperous, including in trade relations with the people in Gaza, because they said this is not worth the headache. And if they were to get any security guarantees, they would very willingly demobilize more forces in the West Bank and all of these different areas. And it's not even up for debate. They've shown that with their neighbors. Anytime one of their neighbors, like the relations they enjoy now with Jordan, even though Jordan attacked them twice, are extremely cooperative and helpful. Jordan helped use their airspace and aircraft to fend off the attack from Iran. So there's really no basis to say they just want to oppress and they won't go for peace. So the burden of proof is on the people, the Arab group around them that is consistently rejecting peace offers and initiating hostilities, because we have proof that they will work with Arab partners when they have the option to.
Yeah, and even he asks, like, why weren't the Palestinians part of the Abraham Accord dialogue and discourse? And you mentioned it before too. They've rejected every peace proposal, including Oslo, which gave them quite a bit of concessions for what they wanted, because they're only interested in their zero-sum aims. So it becomes very difficult to negotiate with an actor who is not willing to make any sort of concessions. So it's also like, well, are you not going to look to the Palestinian people? And also, we've talked about other Arab states, and you kind of just mentioned it. Even with Egypt, they don't want to inherit this radicalism. So they all kind of champion the cause, but they haven't made any strides in helping achieve some sort of a solution. I want to correct myself. This is now the clip where Ben talks about aid going to Gaza.
I mean, I'm perfectly happy for it not to remain Israeli land, but that doesn't mean that it can be governed by the current entities that the Palestinians are choosing to govern themselves. The last entity they did, Israel, pulled down in 2005. A terrorist group now ruled the region and then promptly used it to build kilometers of terror tunnels that outsize the London subway network.
I want you to understand, Ben, that there is no way for any type of democratic institution or process to happen in the Gaza Strip when there's an occupying force who will go and subvert it. If you have Israeli parliament,
so they don't have agency.
If you have, I mean, it's hard to when there's an occupying force.
Actually, believe it or not, it actually is not that hard not to vote for terrorists.
It
is not.
It's not. It's 100% impossible for you to go and make that distinction when there is no alternative.
Okay, so I don't know where the aid clip went, but he basically just kind of summarized everything that we just said. I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on that before I move to the next clip.
Yeah, and I think we kind of covered it.
This war would be over today.
And the hostages should be released, and no civilians should be involved in the conflict.
Should Hamas surrender?
So I want to
Hamas surrender?
I think that there should be no civilians involved in the.
Should Hamas surrender?
Surrender to who?
To the Israeli government.
Will the Israeli government stop bombarding civilians if that is? Because
if Hamas surrenders, yes.
Because right now we saw them march from the north to the south of Gaza, and they said that the whole goal of this war was to what? Was to return the hostages, correct?
I mean, there's a dual goal. One was to destroy Hamas,
now,
and the other was to return the
hostages. See, that's the thing.
When
I come to the table.
Okay, so I think he asks a great question. So should Hamas surrender? And then he retorts, well, surrender to who? To Israel. And he goes, okay, well, then will they stop bombarding the Palestinian people? And it's like, yes, that is quite literally how this would happen. So there doesn't even seem to be like this recognition as to the causes and to the effects of why Israel is conducting a counteroffensive in Gaza. And he mentions the hostages. And then in the next clip I have, he goes on to say that there's dual aims. So it's to get the hostages home, but also to destroy and delegitimize Hamas. Do you have any thoughts on that clip?
Yeah, no, I think I have some, but I'll wait for you to play that one and react to the whole thing, because I think Mohammed's very off on this.
Okay, sounds good.
So then the hostages are placed second to this. So this isn't about, there can't be dual goals.
Of course there can.
How?
Why could there not be
Because one of these goals is completely antithetical to returning to the last one.
How?
Because
in fact, they are deeply connected. If Hamas does not surrender, how are the hostages getting back?
Again, I'm saying because every operation that dealt with returning the hostages involved the death of arguably more civilians and more hostages in the area.
Okay, take it away.
Yeah, so one, he's just fundamentally confused. He thinks that if there are multiple aims in a given conflict or military operation, that it's somehow illegitimate, or that the only thing they should do would be to go back and get the hostages. But imagine if in 9/11, in addition to killing a bunch of people, they'd also got a few airliners full and kidnapped people back. And so yeah, they killed people, but then imagine people were to say, okay, you can try to go get the hostages and do that, but if you have multiple aims, if you also want to bring to justice the people that killed and maimed and decapitated and dismembered and raped all those other people, they're dead now. Just move on, focus on the hostages, and then that's your only legitimate aim. It's morally insane. It's just, you have to look at the sequence of it. Again, I always put this through the lens of assume the worst possible motives on the part of the Israelis. If they just wanted to commit a genocide, which someone else gets into later, again, misunderstanding the word, or they just want to take the land or they want to occupy it or whatever, why couldn't they have done that before October 6th? They have the military ability, the capability. They're already hated by the international community. It's not like they have to really worry about their reputation very much since they're vilified so constantly. The only logical sequence is they were actually in the process of expanding peace with their neighbors, with their Arab partners. Hamas and Iran did not want that to happen. They initiated this attack knowing that it would preempt a response, knowing that the blood of thousands of innocent Palestinians would be on their hands, because necessarily in urban warfare, to go in and try to take out these enemies that are cowards and hide in tunnels, you have to have collateral damage.
Yeah, I think what this guy is missing, which also, to be clear, I'm not entirely sure even what his argument is the entire time he's debating Ben. He's just kind of objecting to all of Ben Shapiro's points. But first off, I think he's an example of someone who's kind of uncomfortable with, he says, well, I think no civilians should die. But unfortunately, that's just not the reality of war. And even as Christians, we live in a fallen world. Unfortunately, this is just one of the negative externalities of living in a world where there are wars and there is sin. And then it also kind of undermines, well, if you're pro or at least sympathetic to Hamas, their stated objective and aim is to kill every Jew from the river to the sea. So that is innocent civilian life. And then there's also just a complete lack of understanding of just war theory, which we've had Mark Levesque on multiple times to talk about how your response to a provocation, such as October 7th, has to be proportionate, but not proportionate like eye for an eye. Like Israel wasn't going to go get 250 plus hostages from Gaza and kill 1,200 people in a similar manner to what Gaza did on October 7th. The proportionate response is responding to what their stated aims are, which is to annihilate Israel off of the map. And so that ideology and that aim has to be eradicated for the security of Israel. And every state operates to maximize their security. That is what a state is most interested in, its sovereignty and its security. So Israel's operating as any country would have under those circumstances, and with a high degree in discrimination. Israel's been highly discriminate. The walkie-talkie and the pager operation is just one example of some of the most highly discriminate warfare, in that it killed only the terrorists. I believe there's only a few casualties that came from that. And those casualties are at the hands of that terror member, not at the hands of Israel. So really what we've seen with Israel, which the history books might show in years and years and years from now, even though, popular opinion and dialogue in the media won't allow, is that Israel has successfully carried out a highly discriminate campaign to minimize the loss of civilian life. But of course, that's not recognized because it doesn't fit the popular narrative. But yeah, I think that was the last clip from this guy. I think he obviously champions the Palestinian cause. But if you really do champion the Palestinian cause for self-determination, Hamas and blaming Israel is going to perpetuate the cycle that they've been in since 1948, which is never achieving statehood because they've rejected every peace deal and negotiation that's been presented to them. Okay, so this clip is about genocide, and we see this all the time. Like when we go to rallies, people or protest, or these college encampments, people will have signs talking about the genocide of the Palestinian people. Ironically, those same people will oftentimes have posters with provocative and disgusting anti-Semitic imagery of essentially throwing away Israel, throwing away the Jewish people, which is actually more along the lines of promoting genocidal intent. So we're going to see Ben challenge this young lady's definition of genocide. And there's a few kind of, I'll let her blunder and kind of demonstrate her lack of understanding herself, but it's quite comical.
There's a genocide going on in the Gaza Strip, does not understand the definition of the word genocide.
Don't tell me, what's the definition of genocide?
A systematic destruction of every member of a population.
Is Israel a system?
But no.
Are they on their way to completing and fulfilling a genocide?
No, they're
potentially, if they kept on going the same way that they're doing, could they completely eradicate the Gaza Strip?
Israel has the military capacity to do that, and they have certainly not done that. And the reason I can say they've not done that is in you know how long it would take them at the current rate to do that, especially given the fact that they are completely targeting terrorists.
So Ben Shapiro's definition is correct in that it's supposed to point to intent. It is intent to destroy in part or in whole, which is why I say that Hamas's attack on October 7th was an act of genocide, because their intent was to destroy in part or in whole. Obviously, they didn't achieve the in whole, the Jewish people. So his definition is just slightly off. It's not the destruction of every single person, but it's the intent to eradicate a people group for who they are, their fixed identity. And as he pointed out, Israel has the capabilities. They could have wiped Hamas off the map immediately after October 7th if their aim was truly to kill every Palestinian. There are the Israeli population, about 20% are Arab. Many of them are Arab Palestinians living within Israel, and they receive the benefits of being full Israeli citizens. So do you have any kind of comments on this initial definition of genocide?
Yeah, once again, to quote the Princess Bride, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. It's probably the most frustratingly misunderstood, misdefined term in all of these things. And again, we never ask you to assume virtuous intent or anything. Like, just assume the worst of the people you're looking at. Do they have genocidal intent? Are they just trying to kill all the Arabs or all the Palestinians? Clearly not. As you mentioned, they could do that in Gaza. They could do that in the West Bank. They could do that in their own country of Israel if they wanted to systematically kill. Like, they have the military capacity to. Do they have the intent to do that? Well, you could assert it, but if you don't see the evidence for that, you don't have the statement of that, you're just kind of putting it out in the air. And then, do they actually have the executed operation of doing that? Clearly not. Why would you go through, announce your strikes, do a slow, like house-to-house gradual push south if you just want to commit a genocide? Just level things. And many other countries, including Western countries at times, have done conflicts far less discriminate, and the justification they use is, it's sad, people are in the way, but like, you're asking us to put the blood of our own soldiers on the line. And between that, like, our duty is to them, and we don't want civilian casualties, but we can't risk our own people. Israel doesn't make that choice. They make the choice to put their sons and daughters on the line, in the line of fire, to try to minimize those type of actions. And clearly accidents or abuses happen, but they actually have a record of prosecuting when that happens. We've known people and had conversations that have lost people in the fighting in Gaza and in other cases. And I have multiple stories I've heard where it's because of the decision between an airstrike or some kind of bomb versus going in, and then people coming out and being in the line of sniper fire and being killed. I know these personal stories. That is not the actions of a genocidal power. It just isn't. If people want to assert it, like, again, you just kind of reach a fundamental block. If somebody's just going to tell you that red is blue and die on that hill, at some point the word just doesn't have a shared meaning.
Yeah, it loses all meaning. And it's frustrating because genocide does have a very specific legal and academic definition, of which has been debated long before October 7. But the important kind of designation of the term compared to civilian casualties in urban warfare, which is a different designation, is in the intent to do so. So here's the next part 2.
Babies,
Targeting
the kids.
civilian collateral damage is not the same thing as targeting civilians.
But is that not a byproduct of genocide?
No, that is not. Genocide is where you systematically destroy a population specifically because you wish to kill the civilian population. That is
He's right. That's not very pro-life.
Well, no. It turns out that Hamas is not pro-life when they hide behind children.
And neither is Israel when they drop bombs and nukes on Palestinian villages.
Okay, are you suggesting that Israel is using nuclear weapons?
Is a bomb automatically nuclear?
No, not even remotely.
So that's what I said, a bomb.
Okay. So this girl obviously has no idea what she's talking about at all. And she's quite emotional. And you see her, and throughout the video with the other claims that are made, people come up and they're talking like this. And like, yeah, Ben, like you tell me. It's so funny because they quite obviously demonstrate their ignorance on the issue in kind of their righteous indignation. She kind of makes the claim, well, isn't the loss of innocent life a byproduct of genocide? And no, that would be the intentional aim of genocide being fulfilled, not a byproduct or a negative externality. Yeah, that is the aim. So if you fail at that aim, then you're really bad at genocide, but that is the end goal, not an unfortunate negative externality, which then is what happens with urban warfare or just any warfare. I don't know if the next clip I have has this, but he basically asks her like, so then what war, according to you, isn't genocide? But I'm going to wait to see if that's actually part of the next clip. Do you have any kind of thoughts on the second part?
I'll react after that one. I'll maybe tie it up, yeah.
Who are living in the Gaza Strip. The total number of war dead at this point, according to best available statistics, is somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 dead. Okay. That is not a genocide. It is a horrible, horrible war with horrible human casualties. That is not a genocide.
To your definition, which I will have to disagree with. But that brings me to my next question.
Name a war that isn't a genocide by your definition.
One that isn't a genocide?
Yes.
There's plenty of genocides. They've happened.
I don't know. My point is that you don't seem to be distinguishing between the definition of a war and the definition of a genocide. Well, you're saying that if mass casualties...
Okay, yeah, so I'm glad I got that one because his question is accurate. And so, okay, so according to you then, if genocide just means innocent lives are lost, what war isn't a genocide? And her response is so funny. It's like, well, there's been plenty of genocides. I'll let you just react and then I'll go after.
Yeah. It's again, like moral fervor and almost invincible ignorance, because it's okay like to not know everything, but if you're using things and then you're given the explanation or the definition and you have no counterpoint, but you just say, I disagree, or that's wrong. And then you play whack-a-mole hopping around with your claims, which is what most of these people do when they're refuted on something. They just hop around or say like, well, are you saying this? And try to take something he's saying out of context. Yeah, I mean, she can't think of one single example. When faced with that, I think you're more often talking to the audience and for the benefit of the audience than to the specific person. But it just as a broader, like rhetorical, philosophical point, these things get so difficult when you can't have shared meaning in language. Like you can have two massively opposed people. You can have radical atheist communists and a fundamentalist Christian. You could have a Baha'i and a, Satanist, whatever. And every human is capable of rational dialogue. If you can have shared meaning of words and you can build up your premises and figure out where do you have shared principles, where do you have shared notions, and then where do you depart? And then zone in on that, see what it is. Is it a misunderstanding of a word or a term? Like, is it a fundamental difference in metaphysical belief? You can sort these things out. But if people can't define words for you, hop around and just, substitute like emotional fervor for argumentation, there's only so much you can do. You can hope that maybe in the quiet of the night later on, they'll kind of see the flaws in their argument. But, it's a broader thing that we can get into in this podcast of postmodernism and emotion and self-identity, redefining language and usage as power games.
Yeah. And you see this, like they pointed out, the postmodern kind of post-Christian world that we live in, where there isn't truth, capital T. Every definition is then malleable to your point because everything is constructed, and it makes it really difficult to even debate from equal playing ground. At another point in this debate video with Jubilee, abortion was one of the other claims that Ben Shapiro makes. Obviously, he's very pro-abortion as an Orthodox Jew. And the girl asks him, well, what's an abortion? Oh, sorry, pro-life. Did I say pro-choice? I back that up real good. No, he's pro-life. I meant to say that the pro-choice girl debating him asks him, well, so then what's an abortion? Define an abortion. And he goes on to define it. And then she says, well, so is a C-section an abortion? And he's like, no, because the baby's being delivered just through maybe less traditional means to save the life of the baby. And she goes, well, that's your definition. And you see it with this definition of genocide too. She goes, well, that's your definition. So it becomes really difficult to debate people who aren't even debating from facts or truth. And this isn't even like biblical or theological truth. This is just genocide and abortion and definite terms that have very specific meanings. Some genocide, Srebrenica, Rwanda, Darfur, the Uyghurs in China, and then you have the Armenian genocide, and then of course the Holocaust being the main precedent for the term to answer the question that Ben posed. And she said, well, there have been ton. And in all of those situations, there is a very obvious campaign on the part of the government to other the people group they seek to eliminate, disparaging language. Oftentimes, the people group is asked to wear an external identifier that they are part of that other group. So obviously the Star of David during the Holocaust with Jude written on it identified those under German occupation as Jewish. And we don't see any of that happening. None of the classic hallmarks that you're going to learn in a history class or an international affairs class can be applied to what's happening in Gaza. It is, as Ben says, just a really horrific negative outcome of conflict and war. One last clip to react to. It kind of has to do with genocide. But this kid basically asks, would you care if it were Americans being killed like the Palestinians?
Everything were the same conditions of what you see to be terrorism, what you see to be from the Israel side, but it happened in the United States, and the innocent civilians that died were United States citizens. Would you see the same thing to be justified?
So let's say that the United States had launched an attack across the Mexican border, specifically targeting civilians, slaughtering 1,200 of them, taking 250 hostage, and then the Mexican government had retaliated by attempting to solely target military targets, and our military men and women were hiding behind civilians. That would be the comparable condition.
Yeah, so U.S. citizens would be killed in hospitals and other things.
I would not blame the Mexican government. I would not blame the Mexican government for targeting the personnel who were responsible for the kidnappings and murder.
Do you see it to be ethically justified for them to kill innocent Americans at the same degree that they killed innocent Palestinians?
Okay, so he's trying to make like some moral claim. And that's actually the end of his claim because the timer runs out for the debate on that section. So we never got to kind of see that one play out. But essentially, he's making kind of a moral claim. Would you care if they were Americans, insinuating that his political bias or his political slant somehow morally justifies to himself Palestinians being killed? What would you say to this young man who has been quite provocative, by the way, on these Jubilee debates?
It's the perfect way Ben responds, and this isn't a partisan point. This should be how anyone does it. Someone proposes a thought experiment. So say country X does action Y. As a general principle, would you support it here if you change the identities of the two groups? That's actually a great position in reasoning to see, do you have a bias? Do you value some people less? Are you doing a double standard? And so Ben takes it and paints the exact similar picture. If you had a bunch of Americans marauding across the border, raping, pillaging, slaughtering, attacking, and kidnapping, and then going back, hiding in civilian targets. And if our military personnel and the guns and all that, we would occasionally hide in hospitals, and we use that as the base of operations and all of those things. Ben says basically, yes, I would see Mexico to be morally justified in going about to return the hostages and hold those accountable for those actions and prevent it in the future. And the guy kind of like wants to skip away from that and not really get into the details because it is clear once he paints the picture that it falls apart. It's not about valuing any other race more, any group, any religion, anything. It's about common humanity. And if we can't distinguish between, the aims of what Hamas is doing, the situations that they've had that have led up to this, and the aims that Israel has and their willingness to make deals whenever they can, there's not a whole lot else you can show to people, and you just have to hope that that moral framework will stand out eventually and kind of get through to people.
Mm-hmm. You're always more hopeful than I am about people kind of arriving to maybe a better position.
You never know. People can change after decades, but I think also especially as Christians, how these things should always be engaged in, like treat the actor you're dealing with respect, take their claims seriously, dismantle them when they're necessary, but also recognizing that it's the audience that is around you and we should be examples of being able to take claims and engage with them rationally, but also, have that view of the individual we're speaking to and their dignity, and then the wider audience and hope for change. I think because of cultural reasons, lack of education, all these things, it's getting increasingly hard, especially for young people, to make these distinctions, because it's some effort and some training and inculcation and a value for truth in a capital T sense, like you were saying, that presupposes having these dialogues. But I do have hope that there's, a spark of natural reason within us that can see on the face of it sometimes those kind of distinctions, and we can bury it under ideologies and emotions. But even if it's a remnant that's holding forth to that truth, I think there's still hope.
Well, I'm going to leave it there because it's on a happy note, versus maybe a more pessimistic take I might have. I do have a lot of sympathy for, if you look at the people who he's debating, most of them are younger. They're not necessarily college age. I think in the initial Charlie Kirk debate, they kind of presented them as college age. A lot of the people in the video are TikTokers, they're political influencers. So these are people who are very much convicted in what they believe, but you can tell they've been brainwashed because they're regurgitating what they've heard kind of peddled by the mainstream media, especially on this issue of Israel. And so I do have a lot of sympathy for people coming up in this generation and the coming generations, because they are so heavily inundated and influenced by social media. And if you don't have a God, if you don't adhere to, even I think of just some of the traditional values of the Abrahamic faith, if you are your own God and you're living in this postmodern world where you're empowered and told that, your truth is true, then what these people have said in the interview or the debate makes a lot of sense. So I have a lot of compassion for those who don't know the Lord and are trying to make sense and reason through current events without that truth to guide them. So when you think about it in that way, the madness makes a little bit more sense, but it's very disheartening. But as always, Isaac, thank you so much for joining the Philos Project podcast. We'll have more provocative stuff in the culture to react to in the future, I'm sure.
Excellent. Thanks, Dominique. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Philos Project podcast. If you would like to learn more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we do have a Pathfinder course, which I will link below. It's fully subsidized. You can take the mini course to help understand the complex dynamics of the region, which contributes to this conflict. The Philos Project is a nonprofit. All educational offerings, including the podcast, are done at the generous contribution of our donors. If you feel led to give to the Philos Project and our educational programming, such as this podcast, I will leave a description box below. And we greatly appreciate your consideration and giving. Hope you have a great week, and I will see you next week.